sci-fi and fantasy short stories. Of Portals and Portents by Lesley Herron. Chapter 7, In the Sick of It. Ink streaked across the page as a tremor all but caused Eric to launch the pen from his grip. Swearing, he looked down at the crooked line like it had just offered him insult. That was his third page ruined by his inability to steady his hands. Not like what was written there had been legible anyway. Sighing, he moved his attention toward the window. There was something so soothing, so calming about the transition from a frozen, frosty landscape to lush, golden fields of grass that swayed in the wake of their passing train. In the opposite direction, the glassy ocean was broken with whitecaps that crashed against the rocky shore, spraying those windows with seawater. But even that astonishing beauty could not distract his frustrations for long. Eric looked down at his blackened fingers. They could barely hold a pen right now. How was he supposed to work with complicated machinery, assuming he ever got the chance again? Like everything he did in life, he attempted to jump right into physical therapy both feet first. He had started with transcribing his original theory on time travel, in hopes it might help him understand how he had recently achieved it with only his mind. But the moment he tried reading back over what he had written, he'd been less than pleased to see only angry scribbles grinning back at him. They weren't the least bit decipherable as equations. He shifted tactics, and, clutching that pen once more, Eric had attempted writing something so familiar to him he could easily do it in his sleep. His name. Only, when he looked back over his hour-long progress, he almost chucked the book out the window in exasperation. He had reverted back to his toddler years, the letters separate from one another and varied in both style and size. He sighed and turned past his freshly marked-up page and settled on something that should be marginally easier. Numbers. He held his right hand tight to the page with his left and slowly pulled the nib across the surface. After a few test 1s and 2s, he was delighted to see they were mostly coherent. Now all he had to do was relearn how to write the alphabet, and he could pass first-grade English. Again. He had just pushed the tip of his pen on a new line when half a shrimp sandwich appeared beneath his nose. Indiga, mouth full, smiled and wiggled the food in an offering manner. "Hungry?" Shying away from the sandwich, Eric shook his head. "I'm allergic to shellfish." He shuddered away the smell and moved his eyes back to the window. The tall, windswept fields were being broken by solitary farmsteads and occasional grist mills. Lurching, the train began to slow, and the squeal of brakes overtook the gentle chatter of the other passengers inside their car. Eric leaned farther against the window, forcing his eyes to take in the reason for their change in speed. He jumped back on impulse as a soaring marble wall came rushing up at him. For a split second, he thought they were about to crash into the titanic structure. But the train slid through a narrow tunnel. Then they were plunged into darkness, having only the dim lanterns that hung above them to save them from the pitch. Just as Eric was about to ask how long this tunnel was and why they didn't have adequate lighting for such a journey, they were thrust into the blinding daylight. A tightly packed, cookie-cutter city came into view, but he couldn't help but follow the wall with his gaze. It circled the entire city, parts of it disappearing straight into the mountains on one side and the other dipping into the ocean.
"Welcome to Livermore, our one and only stop in the country of Nuea."
A voice broke over the crackling intercom as the train slowly came to a stop outside a massive station.
"If this is your final destination, please claim all luggage and personal belongings in a timely manner. If you are carrying on to Dapplemere, please remain seated and we will depart shortly."
Notebook in hand, Eric stood, adjusting his back with a satisfying pop. And in the next moment, absolute chaos engulfed him. The hurried travel-goers entering and exiting the passenger car swept him away, and, after a very confusing 60 seconds, found himself standing on the crowded stone platform. He had stumbled and tripped, landing against a wooden column that supported a massive metal shade-giving awning, which he was hiding behind for protection. The hectic lifestyle of Livermore was the polar opposite of the communal families of Oakery. Many of the people here had paid Eric no mind, despite his painful stumbling gait or his wayward crutch that now lay several feet away from him, as they pushed and shoved at one another, on and off the train. The smell of coffee and breakfast bagels mixed with the smoke from the train, and their conversations were loud enough to drown out the conductor's shouts for last boarding. There was one thing, however, these busy and cranky Livermorners did pause for: a black and white husky the size of a polar bear. Eric watched as the dog parted the crowds like some ancient biblical figure. Having an opening at last, he dove for his crutch and then rushed over, as best he could on two mostly toeless feet, to latch onto the beast. Under the protection of the dog's massive size, they left the busy platform and stepped out onto the warm, sun-kissed street. People were going about their day, blissfully unburdened by the kind of cosmic deity to-dos that weighed on Eric. He sighed as his gaze followed an electric motorbike that zipped by him, unable to squash that familiar tickle of interest.
"So, where are we off to now?"
His enthusiasm evaporated when Indiga tapped Eric on the shoulder. He frowned, looking up at the Selkie with a shrug.
"Honestly, I was kind of hoping you would know. I didn't exactly stop and ask Kadiani where I was supposed to find a god."
Digging a finger beneath his bandana, Indiga looked at the teeming crowds filling every available inch of the city.
"Perhaps we can ask around? Surely they have a temple or some holy sanctuary. But, maybe try asking nicely for a change, yeah?"
Raising his hand to argue, Eric took a moment before conceding.
"I'll try."
With a deep breath, he stepped into the flow of foot traffic and tried to wave down the next person coming their way.
"Excuse me."
The person he had chosen had their nose buried in the business section of the newspaper and bumped right into him, spilling their coffee everywhere, but mostly down Eric's front. They began to curse, complain, and shout until finally they looked up to see a giant dog, a disabled Selkie, and a hobbled half-elf. Eric looked at this person, realizing that despite all the modern amenities around him, this was still a land of fantasy and lore. Standing before them was an elf, not unlike himself, but this woman had dark brown skin, black hair, and where his pointed ears were straight, hers followed the curve of her head, nearly meeting behind her skull. Her umber-colored eyes stared at them for a moment, before she reached down to pick up her dropped items. She shook out her paper before returning her attention to the odd pair. "You do realize you're standing in the middle of the sidewalk." Indiga gave Eric a nudge and whispered, "Remember, manners." Eric, who was still shaking the scalding coffee from his coat, shot the Selkie a murderous look before taking another deep breath.
"I'm so sorry about that. We're new in town. But, can you tell us where to find the nearest temple? And perhaps the name of whatever god is worshipped here in Nuea?"
Her eyes shifted from the men to the dog and then back before she belted out a hysterical laugh. She remained that way, guffawing and clutching her stomach for several moments before a stitch in her side began to silence her. She straightened up, wiping the tears from her eyes as she shook her head at both of them. "You really are new. there are no temples or places of worship here in Levermorn. What do we look like, savages? The only thing we hold in reverence is the almighty dollar." She turned and pointed to a massive building, tall enough to cast long shadows. "The tech center there is the closest thing to a god you'll find this side of the wall." Indiga could see the growing excitement on his friend's face, a sparkle lighting up those bright blue eyes. He waggled a finger at the man. "Don't go getting any ideas now, eh?" He looked back at the dusk elf. "And what about outside the wall?" The woman crumpled her now empty coffee cup and tossed it in the recycling bin that sat outside the nearest building. She shrugged in response. "Sure, you can still find what's left of the occasional temple out in the shakes, assuming you survive long enough." She pointed towards the massive marble wall. "Levermorn is still new, but it's safe. And people, for good reason, don't go poking around in the wilds no more." She folded her newspaper and moved to place it in the proper bin. "No one wants to deal with the scavengers or savages."
If you're done with that?" Eric hobbled a step closer, holding his hand out. He couldn't hide his excitement and was almost bouncing at the thought of another pure, technologically driven city. The woman frowned at him, but handed over the ruined paper anyway. "What do you mean by savages?" Indiga leaned over, scratching an antsy duck behind one of his ears.
"That's what we call them." The woman jabbed at the newspaper. "The Reclaimers." A shudder ran down her shoulders. "They might be able to help you find a god or a temple, but you'd have to convince them you're not food first." She looked at her wrist and immediately tensed. "Crap, I'm late." She didn't offer them a wave or a smile, not even a goodbye. She simply danced around the dog and began running towards a shopping center that sat next to the train station. Eric flipped the newspaper out before folding it back up to search for what the woman had gestured to. An easy find, as the headline read, "Reclaimers spotted. Only 2 kilometers away. Beware." He squinted at the black and white image of a blurry photograph depicting someone covered in rags and shredded cloth peering around a twisted tree. Of course, he thought, as he folded the paper into thirds and shoved it into his bag. Why couldn't it ever just be a frolicking journey through a meadow of butterflies? Or something? But no, it had to be cannibals. Bracing himself for the cold, Herron clenched shut his eyes and reached for the edge of the porcelain tub as the maid, a hobgoblin named Teardra, dumped a bucket of fresh water over his head. He thought enough time had passed since his exile, but judging by the way this woman was handling his bath, she didn't exactly hold him in high regard. He tried to tell her he could manage on his own, but the maid simply smacked away his hand and began furiously scrubbing at his skin and scalp. One does not simply tell a hobgoblin no. Taller than their cousins and considerably stronger, the woman was manhandling him like she had when he was a child. "I don't know what you've been up to in your absence, Your Royal Highness." She lifted his left hand to see a filthy, heavy manacle attached to his wrist. She let out a grumble, and with a snap of her fingers, removed the shackle. "But you are filthy!" Herron winced at the ice-cold water as she dumped more on him, and before he could argue, she was yanking the braid from his hair, her long fingers catching on every tangle and knot.
"She is not very nice. Does she not like you?"
With a sigh, Herron spoke in his mind. "I made a lot of mistakes in my youth, Wraith. And even though I was punished after losing my voice, many of Ebra's citizens, our house staff included, are still angry with me."
"You should tell her the truth, then. That way she is not mean."
"What right do I have to ask that I be treated any better than those that I wronged?" Herron kept his eyes on the murky water as the maid brought over another bucket from the chilly spigot.
"Have you forgotten how to bathe in your absence, sir?"
Teardra's face pinched in disgust as she lifted his arm, scrubbing at his pits and then moving to each of his ribs, ignoring the way he winced in pain. She continued to scour at a purple spot on his skin until she realized it was a bruise. She let out a grumble of displeasure.
You'll have to see the healers after this.
She poked at him, chuckling under her breath at his agony.
I think you've got a few broken ribs. I could tell her to stop for you.
What was a little torture at the hands of someone he had wronged, Varen thought. But as the hobgoblin's furious scrubbing threatened to flay his skin from his bones, he was about ready to agree. But the bath chamber door burst open, saving him the trouble, and he looked over to see his half-brother walk, or rather stumble, inside. Flicking his fingers at the servant, Lucian growled,
Out, filthy twisted. Why should have never let you back inside the castle.
Between the heavy slur in his brother's words, the stringent smell of alcohol wafting off of him, and the nearly empty bottle in his hand, Varen was surprised Lucian had found him at all. Teardra didn't dare disobey, and set down her rag and bucket. She grabbed the ends of her filthy apron and curtsied so sweetly, dipping her head to hide her snarling smile. Without a word, she slipped from the room and disappeared through the door meant for the servants. Varen watched her go before turning back to his half-brother and questioning his actions with a lift of his brow. The elf took a long, final swig from the wine bottle before he hurled it in his direction. The man's aim was terrible. It smashed against the far wall, but he grinned triumphantly as if it had struck true.
I'm glad to see you finished weeping on the ramparts. I have a few things I need to get off my chest, brother, and you're gonna listen to them.
Lucian swaggered over to the tub, glaring down his long, straight nose at the man.
You think you're so much better than me, but you're not.
He bent, smacking a hand into the water, spraying Varen in the face.
You think I'm so evil, but guess what? You fed me to Elias, knowing full well what he was playing host to.
Helpless to do anything but sit beneath the murky, sudsy water, Varen shook his head. Lucian cut off any arguments with an impulsive jerk of his hand.
No, you left me there. For months. I was suffering in the bitter cold with filthy twisted, while you were all nice and cozy in your tent.
He slumped against the tub until his forehead was nearly pressed against his brother's.
I know I wasn't always kind to you, and for that no, you know what, I'm not sorry.
He stood.
But I certainly don't think my behavior warranted Elias's wrath, or this.
He lifted his robes, displaying a very crooked leg that had healed wrong.
He did that to me, and more, because of you.
A drunken laugh burst from his throat.
Tortured for months, waiting for my heroic little brother to rescue me. But did you?
Varen wanted to point out that Lucian was no more innocent of Elias's anger than he was. They had conspired together to form a plan that led to their father's death, after all. But he could tell the elf was looking for a fight, and a physical altercation was one he couldn't deal with sitting neck-deep in the water. He began slowly extracting himself from the bath when his brother lunged, wrapping his fingers around the lip of the tub. Varen moved with near preternatural speed, rising to his feet to block, only to realize that the look on Lucian's face was not one of rage. He nearly tripped as he stumbled from the tub just as his brother arched his back and emptied the contents of his stomach, which was mostly wine, into the murky bathwater. Lucian moaned, his eyes drifting closed for several moments.
What's funny is... He burped, and then vomited again. While I hated you and your brother, I actually became fond of you. Busy wrapping the heavy wool bathrobe around himself, Herron nearly missed his brother's words. He froze as they sank in, and he turned, a frown tugging at his brow.
He is very drunk.
Sure his stomach had been properly emptied, Lucian stood, but his twisted leg wobbled unsteadily. A firm hand caught him, keeping him upright. He turned to see the prince steadying him and reaching for his cane. He tapped his hand against his little brother's cheek several times. You are always the best of us, you know. Herron wasn't sure why he was helping the man who had toyed with him his entire life. Lucian had stopped pretending to be close with him after Elias had nearly killed them both, and he blamed him for not killing his brother when he had the chance. But perhaps it was simply that Herron recognized that look of rock bottom. He sighed and handed the elf his cane, taking a step back once he was sure his brother could stand on his own. Always so noble. Placing his hand on the prince's shoulder, Lucian glanced down at the dancing shadows on the wet stone floor. Which is why I don't understand why you've aligned yourself with this. He stabbed the end of his cane down into Herron's silhouette. I thought you would have learned from our brother's mistake. He could see the argument rising, and Lucian shook his head. Don't play innocent. He released his grip. I've heard you speak. I know how to spot a revenant. After that imposter came here claiming to be Elias, I did my research. I am well aware of what they can do. He held the end of his cane in the shadow for a long, tense moment before he released it and took a step back. Make sure its presence here is brief.
We are not all the same,
Wraith informed the prince with a note of pride in his voice. Lucian gave his brother a look, half pity mixed with envy, before letting out a long, thunderous belch. He smacked his lips together several times and turned. I need more wine.
He's gonna be sorry in the morning.
Herron watched his half-brother drunkenly sway out into the dark hallway with a flash of his elegant robes. He had just pushed his fingers to his head, massaging at the frustration, when Teardra marched back into the room.
Good riddance to that stuffy drunk. Never liked him, even as a child.
The hobgoblin looked at the state of the bath chamber and let out a long sigh.
Your Royal Highness is much too old to be playing in the tub.
She snapped her fingers, and the wet flagstones began to steam, drying quickly beneath her spell. Turning to the prince, Teardra gestured at the tub with a long finger.
In.
When he didn't move, she pointed more furiously.
In!
Herron put his hands up and shook his head, signaling for the maid to take a look inside. She frowned, and with a roll of her eyes, Teardra complied. The sight was enough to turn even her stomach. She whirled around, eyes wide in disgust, and shouted,
Why didn't you aim for the bucket?
The pristine marble wall and buildings, the packed streets nestled in the endless sea of brick-and-mortar shops, and the cafes and shady alleyway markets all hid a dark, dark truth. What lay outside the city, beyond the barrier of Levermorn, the remainder of the nation of Nuea was, simply put, a never-ending post-apocalyptic wasteland. Sections of buildings stuck up out of the mud in odd angles, while countless knickknacks, vehicles, and unidentifiable bits of agricultural rubble littered the ground.
After the two of them had bribed a security officer to leave the city, who told them under no circumstances would they be allowed back in, Eric wished they had given this plan of theirs a bit more thought than, "Let's go out into the wilds and speak to what the city dwellers call savages." Roughly an hour had passed, but it felt longer. It was difficult to gauge their distance when everything around them looked exactly the same. Eric wiped the cold sweat from his brow, resisting the urge to shrug off his coat. It was too cold, but the efforts of trudging through the spongy mud had been grueling, causing his legs to tremble and vibrate.
What the heck happened here?
Indiga shrugged.
Grammy used to tell us about a war that happened a long time ago. Maybe it was that. No, this doesn't look like a war zone. It's more like a natural disaster.
Eric scratched behind one of his ears.
Oh, and you'd know the difference, eh?
A cold shudder ran up Eric's spine.
Yes.
He refused to let his mind wander to the only actual war zone he'd ever seen.
Well, according to this...
Indiga retrieved a pamphlet from his shoulder bag. He had snagged it as they wandered past a visitor center.
Levermorn is the only major city left in Nuea due to the catastrophic...
Eric pinched the bridge of his nose and looked over.
Liquefaction? Yep, that's the word.
Indiga chuckled as he opened the folded, glossy page to reveal the inside was filled with all manner of touristy information about the city of Levermorn. Cheap hotels, coffee shops, and scooter rentals.
Oh, well, there's nothing else in here about the land outside the city.
He handed it down to the half-elf.
I guess we're on our own.
Taking the pamphlet, Eric glanced from the obvious model-made rendition of the metropolis to their current surroundings. The road they had been following had deteriorated long ago, whole chunks of stone and concrete swallowed up by the earth. He stopped before a large pit filled with mushy sand. Keeping his missing toes in mind, he carefully knelt down and pushed his fingers into the mud.
Liquefaction only happens when there's too much water in loose, granular soil and an earthquake causes it to vibrate.
Eric looked up at the scattershot buildings and their odd angles, and he realized what he thought were tremors in his feet were actually stemming from the ground. A nearby stone pylon began to sink, stopping after only half an inch, while the back end of a compact electric vehicle rose by that much. The entire landscape was constantly churning, alive and breathing.
That can't be good.
Eric tore his eyes off the shifting mud and handed the pamphlet back to his companion.
Where exactly did that guard say to look for these scavengers?
Scavengers, they had been told, were all crazy and opportunistic adventurers, going out into the shakes to find loot and bring it back for trade. And they were about the only people out here who weren't outright hostile. If anyone could tell them where to find a lost temple, it was them.
East. Although, pretty much everything is east, so that doesn't help much.
Indiga folded the brochure and tucked it away.
Although, now that I think back, he did mention to avoid the northern side of the road.
Eric looked around helplessly.
You mean the road that disappeared half an hour ago? Quit worrying. I'm 100% sure we're still headed east.
Indiga glanced up at the overcast sky, trying to pinpoint the sun without much luck.
More like 92%.
Great. As if the threat of slowly sinking in quicksand, every child's greatest fear, wasn't bad enough, now they had very likely wandered into cannibal territory. Eric lifted a hand and gestured at something dark on the horizon.
Let's head for those buildings over there. If I was a scavenger, that's where I'd look for salvage.
The three of them walked in silence for another hour before reaching what might have once been a busy downtown. Many of the structures were completely destroyed, crumbling as their center of gravity shifted too far. But a few of them still had more than one wall left standing. They wandered through a maze of rubble to find many of the paths were blocked by destruction, forcing them to double back more than once. They took to scouring the ruins for any sign of life. But whatever had happened here, whatever had caused this liquefaction, had been long ago. They did, however, discover a trove of abandoned items. Eric, giddy with excitement, wasted no time before diving in. Dust and mud covered everything, but the destruction to the city had happened so suddenly that most non-essential items had been deserted, left forgotten like a sealed time capsule. Despite the severity of the situation, he was like a kid in a candy store. He had already collected a few waterlogged books and a handful of promising electronic devices that he'd already made plans for. He had just blown the dust off an electronic typewriter, still unsure if he needed it or not, might be good for his fingers, when he pulled open a drawer in the desk it sat on. Inside, he found an unloaded handgun, similar to modern ones he had seen, and a magazine clip filled with several bullets. With a sneer, he started to close the drawer, hungry for better technology, but stopped. As much as he hated firearms, these were desperate times.
Hey, Eric, come take a look at this. One sec.
Eric grabbed the gun and clip, loading it before he shoved it into his pack. He maneuvered his way through the half-fallen structure to a gaping hole in the back. Indiga sat atop Duck, looking out across a graveyard. Unlike most of the city, it was intact. The ground was still muddy but solid, and most of the headstones remained upright.
What do you make of this?
Eric ran his fingers through his hair, looking around at the large swath of land. On all sides, the chaos claimed the landscape, but here it remained undamaged. That didn't make any sense, unless... Indiga slid off the dog's back, landing in front of a grave marker that was roughly carved from wood rather than the marble or stone of the others nearby.
This one looks newer.
He gathered up the sleeve of his coat around his palm and used it to brush the dust off the carved name. Looking for it now, Eric could see more grave sites like this one scattered throughout. These markers were little more than wood slats, placed haphazardly where room could be found. Scavengers wouldn't bury their dead in the wastes, but people who lived here might. Something felt off. His ears focused on what his eyes couldn't see. He still didn't have any glasses. Silence. There was no birdsong or insect chirps, not even a bubble in the mud.
I think we need to leave.
Indigo was already climbing back atop Duck before Eric had even mentioned anything. He was looking around, his eyes sharper than the half-elf's.
It's a bit late for that, yeah?
He pointed to an overturned phone booth, behind which he could see the broken outline of a person, one of at least a dozen he had spotted so far. The figure, realizing they had been spotted, rose. Eric's heart raced, causing his breathing to quicken. They had been warned of the dangerous inhabitants of the shakes, these so-called reclaimers. The humanoid creature walking towards him was robed in hooded garments of frayed and sun-baked leathers, just like the picture in the newspaper.
Okay.
He licked his lips. A shaky plan was forming.
I'll distract them while you hide.
As Indiga made to belt out a laugh, exactly how was he supposed to hide with a giant dog and 2 gimp legs was beyond him, but held it back lest that be seen as a sign of aggression. He slowly raised one hand in greeting.
Hello?
The figure slowed, hefting a spear in one hand and pulling out a short-bladed weapon with the other. Several more bodies began to emerge as well from their hiding spots. Indigo raised his other hand, moving both upwards to show he was unarmed. "We mean you no harm. If you could—" There was a shift in the gravel, followed by the squelching of boots being pulled from mud, and they both turned to see more than a dozen reclaimers nearly atop them, weapons drawn. "I said run!" Eric shoved past the man, drawing the pistol from his satchel. He tried to level it on the nearest attacker, but his trembling fingers fumbled on the trigger, causing the weapon to fire prematurely into the ground. A rusted saber flashed towards him, connecting with the gun and sending it flying from his hand. He watched where it landed in the mud and moved for it, but the fighter advanced, screaming at him in an unknown language. Others from the flock of reclaimers moved forward, their weapons leveled menacingly, but they kept their distance from the giant hound. Indigo chuckled miserably as, unbeknownst to them, Duck was actually a giant baby, and his tail was already between his legs. "Wait!" Eric raised his hands and steadied himself on his feet, only to be kneed in the gut by the one with the sword. He crumpled, hacking out the words, "We come seeking your god." This was the dumbest idea he had ever had, but it was an idea. "I'm on a quest for Kadiani. Please, don't eat us." A murmur broke out over the group. They chattered with one another in their foreign tongue, but Eric could tell by their tone they were discussing something. He realized, with hope, they may have understood him and might even be considering his words. But when the smallest of the bunch moved away from them, shooing the others with a violent hand gesture, Eric's hope evaporated. The reclaimer studied him behind a veil of a hooded cloak and chuckled. It was mirthless and dark, growing into a sinister laugh before the figure uttered one word, something he could understand. "Shaman." "Are you sure about this?" Evan raked his eyes over the scroll several times, making sure his excuse was believable. The others were not going to be happy when they found it, but this wasn't about them. Ambling up to the tiny mark, Barry read over the letter for a moment and nodded. His heart was set, and nothing could change his mind. "All right." Evan breathed in through his nose, exhaling a long sigh before he quickly signed their names and placed it on his empty bed. "You know I'm with you, but I have to ask." He shuffled out of the way, grabbing his few belongings as they moved towards the door. "How exactly are we going to kill Rivaria?" You've been listening to Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron, Book 5 in the series here on Tall Tale TV. If you would like to listen to the entire book in one place, or any of her other novels, you can find them at talltaletv.com/series, or by following the links in the description.
I leave for 5 minutes and I come back. Oh, gross. Look at those floaty bits.
Wraith, please. I have a weak stomach.
Do people usually gurgle like that when they throw up? Like, hubba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da.
Oh, gods. I don't want to think about it.
I don't think he noticed, but some got in his hair when he did that. Do you think we should have told him?
I'm sure he'll find out.
It's kind of like a soup, only with bits of goat cheese and... what is that, corn?
Wraith,
Does it smell as bad as it looks? I don't have a nose. You should sniff it so I can tell. Are you kidding me? That's it. I quit.